as you can see, I was there too, and had the pleasure of introducing Nathaniel to the Sagamore, William Guy, otherwise Po Whoopi Neopog, I get that right, Winds of Thunder is what it translates. He is the sachem and the 10th generation descendant of the Massasoit and King Philip and Simeon Simon. And I thought it was fascinating that behind us, in the painting behind there, is of George Washington. Simeon Simon was a Pokanoket native who served as Washington's bodyguard throughout the Revolutionary War. Followed him, went with him everywhere. And Washington, you recall, really respected the natives as both as warriors, but also knowing the land backwards and forwards. And they depended on that knowledge for the conduct of the war. So, that little piece there, and hopefully we'll move on to rediscovering the 17th century. In Sowams, you'll learn about where Sowams is. You're in it now. But also, I hope to not only tell you some things about Rehoboth, probably 90% of which you already know, but I hope there's somebody here who can add something to that. I was saying earlier that I always enjoy giving presentations in this area because I find the expertise in the audience, all right? So let me start where I started, which was 2.5 years ago. I live in Warren. That's Burrs Hill Park. Anybody ever been to Warren? Good. If you go to the town beach, right across the road is Burrs Hill Park. And what you'll see is a large baseball field there. My house is in the far right corner there, and when the leaves are off the trees, I can see the park very easily. But a month before I retired, I was a clinical psychologist, if you can believe that, for 43 years, okay? But a month before I retired, they came with a backhoe to Burrs Hill Park. This is the section to the left. It's up in some trees in an elevated area of the park. Started digging a hole and placed a monument there, and I'll tell you more about that as we go. I have had some interest in the King Philip War in particular because living in Warren, I was aware that the war actually broke out in what is today Warren. The first shot was fired there. And I did some more research and found out that the first inhabitant of Warren wasn't Warren then, it wasn't even Swansea then, 1653. There was a small settlement of houses, one of whom was occupied by Hugh Cole, who had grown up in Plymouth and moved down here and set up a farm there. And his well is the only portion of that farm that remains. It's covered up with a board there. You can't really see the well, but there was a marker there that had long since been removed because it was bronze, and you know what happens to metal in public areas, and it was gone. So we fortunately found a photograph of it, and were able to recreate that sign in plastic. Of course, then they tried ripping that off, realized it wasn't metal, threw it in the crack pond next there. It floated. Apparently got it out, put it back up. This is the second time it's been placed up there. Now we've got good glue. We think it'll hold. So that was my early history until I met the woman in the lower left, Helen Jader, T-J-A-D-E-R, who had a small company working with land trusts in Rhode Island, who was very interested in the history of the area around Barrington and Warren, which is known as Sowams, S-O-W-A-M-S, which translates as the southern area. After the presentation, you can see a map that Tom Bicknell put together in 1908 of the Sowams Territory. But that's that coastal area that we're talking about here, and that really runs from Bristol all the way up to Providence. Okay? So Helen had this idea of creating a national heritage area, like the Blackstone Valley Heritage Area, in this region, which up to now has gotten very little attention. So she came up with this concept, and if I can get the video to work here, you could hear 4 minutes of her describing that arrangement there, what she had in mind.
It's a story still in the making of those who have gone before us, of generations living now, and of generations yet to come. But welcome to Sowams, the heartland of the Pokanoket tribe of the Wampanoag Nation and Algonquin people. Traditionally, we might start by looking at a map, yet every map has its limitations. This map was developed by Bicknell, a Barrington resident, all of modern Barrington, Warren, Bristol, parts of East Providence, Seekonk, Rehoboth, Swansea, and Somerset are part of Sowams per this interpretation. An alternative is to reflect not only on the land, but also on the water and on the sky, to reach a new appreciation of this place by looking to the natural cycles. It's been estimated that the Wampanoag peoples lost up to 90% of their population in a devastating wave of epidemics from 1617 to 1619. The Pilgrims ventured to establish their colony in the wake of this devastation. Population losses differed across indigenous populations who were not affected simultaneously or equally, creating a severe imbalance of power. In March 1621, at the time of the new year, the Massasoit Assiniboine established a peace treaty with Plymouth Colony that lasted for over 50 years. This was the very first treaty between indigenous people and the colonists of North America. Between the national myths surrounding the first Thanksgiving in 1621 and the 1675 to 1676 conflict known as King Philip's War, that long peace is missing from our national narrative of the interactions between the Wampanoag Nation and the settlers of Plymouth Colony and those of Providence Plantation. In the early 1990s, a group of amateur archaeologists began excavations on land that was then owned by the Rhode Island Country Club. Found items in the upper soil levels included a 1699 half-cent, a copper button, and a glass stopper. Lower layers revealed many stone tools, including arrowheads, knives, scrapers, drills, hammerstones, and reamers. But they also encountered something unique in Barrington and highly unusual throughout southern New England, a cluster of crescent-shaped stone hearths. In Bristol, Papa Squash is believed to be a corruption of papoose and squaw. Sowams Woods, Barrington, was a similar area set aside for women and for childbirth, a place of peace. And thanks to the work of many partners, Sowams Woods is again a place of peace, with hiking trails open to the public and fishing access to Echo Lake. The property that could best express this heritage and contribute to a rebalancing of our commemorations lacks permanent protection and has limited public access. Pokanoket, the lookout, also known as Montop or Mount Hope, although these are likely names used by settlers, is in Bristol. It includes King Philip's seat and the spring where Metacom was killed. It can be argued that Sowams is the pivotal place of cultural exchange between indigenous people and colonizing settlers in North America. Few people realize that there was a peace treaty between the Pokanoket tribe and the Puritans established around March 21st, 1621, which lasted over 50 years. One idea to consider is the establishment of a Sowams National Heritage District, which could provide a framework for an appreciation of Sowams and the role of the Pokanoket in the heritage of our country. A Sowams district could provide an encompassing approach featuring the essential cultural, natural, scenic, historic, and recreational open spaces of Sowams in a way that celebrates this layered history for residents and draws new visitors. If we begin now, we could ensure that the Sowams Heritage District is well established before the 400th anniversary of the Peace Treaty in 2021.
So, that's how I heard about the Sowams heritage area and that concept. As Helen was saying, this includes an area that actually goes up to Providence. The yellow map on the upper right is the Pokanoket Territory, which goes all the way up to the Charles River in Boston and includes all of Providence County there to the upper left. The Pokanokets only lost that shortly after the Great Dying that took place along the coast between 1616 and 1619, when Canonicus thought, well, this is a good chance to grab some land, and started moving into Pokanoket territory. And they would have come over here, and we would be Narragansett, had it not been for the treaty with the English, who protected the Massasoit and actually rescued him at one point from an attempted invasion in 1623 by Canonicus and the Narragansetts. This is an important area here. You notice in the lower right, this is the intersection of a number of tribes. The Nipmuc up in Massachusetts and parts of Connecticut. Of course, the Massachusetts, where the Mass Bay colony was, they, by the way, were severely wiped out by that the Great Dying before the people arrived in Plymouth. So that area was relatively free of occupied native people. Wampanoag, and you are probably most familiar with the name Wampanoag, but that name never appeared anywhere in the literature till after 1702. That was a name meaning Eastern people, but it replaced the name Pokanoket as part of the genocidal effort of the English to remove the Pokanokets after the King Philip War. You don't have a name, you don't have a language, you're not here, you know, that's your punishment for going to war against us. So that orients you to the land. No, you had a question?
Yes, please. What defined the borders between the two tribes, the boundaries? Was that a fixed boundary they all agreed on, or was it just kind of a flexible thing?
The border between?
Between tribes.
Well, those were not so, yeah, that map is an oversimplification. The borders did change over time. There were agreements about hunting rights, fishing rights, one thing and other things changed, but there was a good knowledge of the land, and you knew where you were supposed to be and where you're not supposed to be, that kind of thing. Obviously, there are no markers or anything, but they would typically use rivers and natural landscapes to define that. People who lived here for 10,000 years were, as far as we know, quite successful. It's only archaeological evidence because there's no written history, but there's no evidence, for example, of mass die-offs or of famines or things of that sort. We think the people who were here were quite successful and lived very sustainably on the land. Not that they didn't manage the land. They would burn off forests for plantings and travel. They used the rivers extensively and often built fish weirs. So, you know, it's not that they left the land pristine. It's not quite like that. They used the land appropriately, but didn't harm the land in the process, and that was key. Until these folks in the lower left arrived in their floating islands in the 1500s, and they were the Pokanoket people were quite used to seeing people coming on these floating islands and trading with them. But the key feature was, number one, they were all men, and number two, they didn't stay. Okay? They were here specifically for trade, particularly for furs, which were the most lucrative market, but they also came here for fish, cod in particular, and lumber, because you may recall, you have to understand, New England is part of England, and England was devoid, for the most part, of any trees. They'd long since cut everything down that they had. So when they came here, you would have ships that would go back loaded with lumber, logs, strange to float American trees over there, but that's what they needed. I mentioned the Great Dying that occurred in the period between 1616 and 1619. We know that because of eyewitness accounts of that, and people who had grown up in those villages and then came back, particularly Squanto and Tisquantum, who had been captured, taken to England, and then brought back, and discovered that their village of Patuxet, what we know as Plymouth, was littered with bleached bones. People had died in such numbers that there were no one left to bury the dead. So that's what the Pilgrims found when they came into Plymouth Harbor in 1620 in December. But of course, their interpretation was quite simple. God had prepared the way, okay? Cleared land, gardens ready to plant, etc. Of course, it was December and they were going to have a tough time, as they did. But they had heard stories about what happened in terms of disease, and they noticed that there were no native people approaching them that winter, even though they had encountered some, you recall, out in Cape Cod, but very brief skirmishes, but no large groups of tribal people coming to see what was happening in Plymouth. Well, there was a good reason, because Osamequin, the Massasoit, who was living in probably either Warren or Barrington today, wanted to stay away because he knew something awful had happened, and they had suspicions that somehow the English had this power of killing people with disease, and they didn't exactly know how that worked. So it wasn't until March 22nd of 21 that they decided to approach them. And at the time, the Massasoit only had about 60 warriors left out of what we think was a population of about 7,000 at the time. So they had 90% decimation. I mean, that's actually, decimation is 1 out of 10. This is 90%. I don't know what you call that. Anybody know your Latin? I mean, it's like a nuclear bomb was let off in southeastern Massachusetts.
What was the disease?
We don't know. There's lots of speculation, no evidence. And it could be as simple as measles. We think of that as simple. But if you have no immunity, you die from that, especially the elders and children. But it could have been bubonic plague, certainly smallpox, chickenpox, and more than likely, these traders have been bringing a variety of illnesses. And some are speculating leptospirosis that may have taken off in the population and just devastating them. We see the same phenomenon going on today in Africa with villages that have outbreaks of Ebola. When a relative is sick, what do? You come and take care of them, right, in large numbers. Well, that was the same process here, that someone would get sick, other people would come to comfort them, and they would carry it. And then, you can understand that it wouldn't take long before the entire population had been affected. And with no immunity, you had no chance of surviving. So, Osamequin decides, because he's got Canonicus breathing down his neck over the Sequoia River, in order to protect his people with so few warriors available, he's going to make a bold move and make a treaty with the English. Meets with Governor Carver and hammers out something called the Wampanoag Treaty, misnamed because that word Wampanoag was not in use at the time. Should be Pokanoket Treaty, but it's the only time the U.S. government has acknowledged that treaty, which really set the scene for English occupation of this area. If it hadn't been for that treaty, the Pokanokets could have driven the English back. I mean, they were a ragtag group. Half of them died during that first winter. It would not have been difficult for them to get them to leave, okay? But they had something that the tribe needed desperately, guns and cannons. And they knew with that firepower they could at least scare off the Narragansetts, get them to think twice about coming and occupying their territory. Their emissary, if you will, their Secretary of State was Ed Winslow, well-educated man from London, who came with the separatists and became the person who dealt with external people. And during, for instance, when they had the meeting with to hammer out the treaty, Ed was the chosen person to go stay with the tribe, you know, so in case something bad happened, they could get him, and you know. But he was, you know, not only a brave man, but he understood the power of this relationship, and decided that he was going to visit the Massasoit at his home in about July 2nd, we think. He comes down here. This is the Mesozoic Spring that was supposedly where Osamequin had a settlement at the time in what is now Warren. There's a similar spring in Barrington, and if you want to get into the argument whether Sowams was in Barrington or Sowams was in Warren, that continues to this day. However, he came back again in 1623 on news that Osamequin was deathly ill. Traveled a 2-day journey down from Plymouth again with a translator and managed to, if you will, cure the Massasoit. Well, let's put it this way. In the time period that he was there, he did get better. Whether the potions and chicken soup and whatever he gave him actually did the trick, scraping his tongue, one thing or another, we'll never know. There's an interesting theory, by the way. When he came, this was at a time when there was a Dutch trading ship that had run aground in the Warren River, right next to Osamequin's settlement there. And that trading ship had just left when Winslow arrives. So somebody came up with a theory that it was likely that the Massasoit became ill from something that the Dutch trading ship gave him, and one speculation is that he was suffering from botulism, which is something you only get from preserving food and then having oxygen and it goes bad. It doesn't occur in nature, let's put it that way. And that could have been the case. So the Dutch may have poisoned him inadvertently, and but Winslow gets the credit for curing him, and Winslow embraces him and says, Keen Winslow will be friends for life. And he meant it, and he kept that promise. If you want to get some sense of what Sowams looked like back then, you take a Google map and you erase everything, take out all the buildings, and then put in a native village there. That's the Tyler Point in the upper right there. And below that is Brooks Pasture, which was Warren at the time. It was originally Swansea. You know, everything was Swansea originally, except for Rehoboth. And we know it was cleared land because Miles Standish came down. Miles was very interested in this land. Being a good English military man, he saw the real estate potential here and said, we should move into this area because it's already cleared and ready for our animals, right? Of course, there are two differing worldviews between the Pokanokets and the English people there, and I do a whole presentation on just the points in this slide, but just very briefly that the native people lived with the land, not just on it. They hunted animals. They didn't raise them. They thought it was one of the most bizarre things they ever saw was the English brought cattle and pigs and chickens, and they fed them. Good grief, who feeds animals? You go out in the woods and you hunt them. And they did that with a few of the cows, and thinking, well, this is an animal, I shoot it, you know. So they just couldn't get around this idea that you raise your meat, you know, you don't just find it, which they had done successfully for 10,000 years. The English, however, had long since hunted everything and only had the meat that they raised. They managed land, not acquire it. The English were into property. They had use agreements, you know, you can fish here, you can hunt there, and not purchases. This is my land, you stay away. Religion was part of everything. It was their whole life, and nature and the environment around them. Whereas the English had, you know, everything in a book, and you go to church on Sunday, you know, that kind of thing. And they accepted what could not be controlled, whereas the English thought of forces of good and evil. And you have to understand the mindset then at the time was everybody had one book. There's only one book, the Bible. And you read that incessantly, and you practiced that 7 days a week, and you interpreted everything in your life through Scripture, okay? There wasn't any other way to view the world. So, whatever they read in the Bible is what they believed and what they practiced. Native people saw things differently with Manitou or spirits in plants and animals, and had a whole different relationship. They didn't have what you call an organized religion, if you will. Okay. Well, 1636, along comes our good friend Roger Williams, who he had difficulty with people because he thought differently about the role of church and government, and thought that the church was ruining government, and government was ruining the church, and they should be separate. And he started talking about that when he first came to Plymouth in 1631. Then they didn't like that, so he went up to Salem, because he heard that they were open-minded there, started preaching there, and found that they didn't, not that the people of Salem were unhappy with it, but the people in Boston, the Mass Bay Puritans, did not like what Roger was saying and saw him as a threat to their organization. So they waited till January of 1636, sent some troops up to his house, only to find out that Roger had gotten wind of it and had already left. And where does he go? He comes down to the Massasoit, to Sowams here, in order, because he had got to know the Massasoit and learn how to speak his language. Roger was very good at languages, and was sheltered at Margaret's Cave, which is still in Swansea, just over the Warren line on private property. But if you're interested, let me know. I'll get you on the next walk we do there next spring. He was sheltered over that winter for 14 weeks and nursed back to health. If he had died, there would be no providence and likely no freedom of religion. Across the street from where he settled, you will find a monument. Osamequin said, go up to East Providence on Roger Williams Avenue and go down to Omega Park. Right there on the right. He brought his family and some followers down and settled on the pond, which at the time was actually part of the river. There's a couple of the older houses in East Providence. The Daggett House on the right is from 1690, and the Walker House is probably early 1700s. Those are the two oldest houses in East Providence. They're still standing. No houses from prior to the King Philip War were standing because they were all burned during the war. Okay? So here's Roger settling in June, gets his crops planted, and the next thing he hears from Plymouth, you're on our land. You have to remove. Get out of here. So he goes across the Seekonk River. You know this, if you've ever seen the city seal for Providence, what's your knee top? It's on all their trucks. Okay. Went across the Providence River at Slate Rock, landed there, and was greeted by Canonicus, and who took him and said, go around the river and you can settle Providence. Okay. So that's how Providence got to be there. If you need a refresher on this, how many people have been to the Roger Williams National Memorial? Good. It's a great little museum. You can see everything in 30 minutes there. And they have this painting in the lower left there. It's a contemporary painting of of what Providence may have looked like in 1650. You see the settlement, which would be along North Main Street. The water in the back is the Great Salt Pond, which today is where we do water fire. And to the right is a hill that we call Smith Hill, where the State House sits today. And in the background, you see that little green rise at the back there. That's Pokanoket Hill. How many people have been to Pokanoket Hill? Yeah, fewer hands. I never heard of it. I didn't know anything about it. And now I know a lot. I've been there, done a lot of walks up there, one thing or another. It's the western border of Providence, and it was where Canonicus took Roger up on the hill. It's an almost 300-foot hill. It's a beautiful view up there. It's just fabulous. And he said, you can have all of this land, Roger. So that became the western boundary of Providence. There's a soapstone monument, I guess you'd call it, where the native people used to carve out of soapstone, a soft stone. They could make bowls and things of that sort. That's just over the Johnson line there. But we just got it cleaned up this last fall, and we're hoping that we can get a whole National Heritage Area marker there and the whole treatment there. Just some of the relics from prior to 1700, looking for what exists today that was there in 1700. The best I could come up with was the Wampanoag Bridge. Well, obviously that bridge wasn't built in 1700. I think they redid it in the 60s. But it's the 8th version of a bridge that has been there since 1660. That was the crossing point. If you weren't going to come by water from the West Bay to the East Bay, you crossed right there. And it's a very narrow spot in the river. You could understand at low tide how you could wade across there. Well, that was the center of Providence, and became the place for the market. Market Square is on the east side, and there's still the Market Square building there. And on the west side was cow pastures. Okay, now buildings, but you would drive your cattle across and sell them at the market, and people would live all the way up North Main Street. So I finally figured out why Providence is arranged the way it is. It made no sense to me, but now I understand the early beginnings, and it does make sense. Anybody name the 7 hills in Providence? I can't. But it was gradually settled over that time. As was the land all over here. I'm not going to go into all the detail of these land transfers, but you see Rehoboth at the top. That was the first land that was purchased from Massasoit in 1641. I noticed driving in, your sign says 1643. Why is that? You can have land, but you don't have a town until you have what? A church. Okay? You cannot have a town without a church. You can't have a church without a pastor. You can't have a pastor without a parsonage. So the way you do it is you build a parsonage, you go to England or Wales, and you bring in this case it was Newman who came down from Weymouth, okay? Once he was here, then they could build a church. And now you had a town of Rehoboth, okay? Not East Providence. There wasn't any East Providence then. So that's how Rehoboth got settled. But just south of there, you have Wampanoag, a little piece of Riverside there that was sold to Tom Willett and John Brown, who were the first purchasers of that land. Eventually, they bought all of what's Swansea in the upper right there, that whole area. All of that was Swansea, all the way to the coast there. And then it split off into Barrington and Swansea, but then Warren acquired a good part of Barrington, so a lot of Barrington was Warren for about 10 years. And then finally we drew the state line. Anybody know how that state line was determined? You'd think they'd have a survey team that would go out and look at rivers and places and easily demarcate the state line. No. there was so much argument about it, they put the map down, put a ruler on the map, drew a line, and said, that's a state line. You know, enough arguing, okay? So that state line goes to the middle of people's property, the farm fields are divided, it's just crazy. And that's why it has this funny bend in it and all that kind of stuff. And I went down, I looked at the survey maps from 1747. They're down at the state archives there, and I said, where's King's Rock on this? They didn't even go there. They had no idea that King's Rock was a perfect, and actually the state line goes right through the middle of King's Rock, which would have been a perfect marker. If they moved it 50 feet north, then that would have been the state line marker. But no, right through. Anyway, so here we are at the Newman Church. I'm sure some of you are familiar with the history of this church. It's been there, you gathered in 1643, you see that down here? And if you go across the street, the fabulous cemetery, some of you are into genealogy, right? Any carpenters here? No? If you're a carpenter, you go there, because they're all there. Okay. But it's a fabulous place. We're going to see if we can't get an interpretive marker to go along with the bronze marker that's over there to tell a little bit more of the story. And you know, of course, that Newman came down here from the bastion of Weymouth, which was kind of Sin City up there as far as the, well, it's not that they were, you know, immoral. It's just that they weren't in line with the Mass Bay Puritans, you know, and they didn't worship quite the same way, and they wanted even more regulations against Catholicism, if you will, and less Anglicism in the church. So that's why the group came down here. But I just learned recently that Aunt Hutchinson was also from Weymouth. I never knew that. She, of course, got kicked out of Boston and sent down to Portsmouth there, and then ended up going down and getting killed in Long Island there. So, East Providence. What do you find there? Hunts Mills. I hope you've all been over there. Okay, wonderful place. The 10 Mile River was, you know how the Ring of the Green worked, you know, that you had frontage on the green and the rear of your property was on water. So you were either on the 10 Mile River on the east side or you were on the Seekonk River on the west side. Fabulous setup there, and it worked fine until the war. But along that river, there were a number of mills built, none of which are existing today, but we know that the mills started in the late 1600s there. So it is a terrific river, and it still is today, and a wonderful place to walk. You like hiking.
Interesting that the 10 Mile River before the glacier ran down in the course of the Robbins River, which is the state line.
Right.
So they're both the state line, and the glacier obstructed with moraine, and sort of in the Route 44 auto mile area, there's a depression there that always fills with water. That's the old course of the 10 mile.
Oh, is it? Yeah. I just noticed that this morning. I came over from East Providence, and I said, wow, this is lowland here.
Yeah.
So that's what it is.
There was a relatively big valley, which was the 10 Mile River Valley.
Yep.
So from 100 miles down, the river was diverted over those waterfalls and down from the old main.
How about that?
Yeah.
Well, the rivers define the area here, and if it weren't for the Palmer, Rehoboth wouldn't be here either. I mean, you know, that's for transportation, for mills, you name it. Yeah. Well, by 1675, the entire area had been filled with colonial settlements, the yellow places, and there's more down in Portsmouth and obviously down in Newport. But the native population was diminishing. We not only had the plagues of 1616, 1619, but there were outbreaks, major outbreaks, like in 1632. So that population just kept getting smaller and smaller and smaller. They also were no longer able to sell furs the way they had been because the bottom dropped out of the beaver market in Europe after 1652. So all these furs that they were bringing down from Maine and other places no longer had the same value. So the only thing that they had of value to the English was land. And both the Massasoit and then the son Wamsuta began selling land, signing deeds for land that covered most of the area, all of the area, in fact, except for the peninsula, which we know today as Bristol. It's actually at Franklin Street in Warren. There was a fence there. Everything south of there was native land, which had never been sold. Okay, that remained in native hands, and it was kind of reserved, if you will, for them. But by then, by the outbreak of the war, there were only about 700 native people living there at that point. All had died, left the area, what have you. So it became English territory. And the concern on the part of Philip, I won't go through the whole story, but you know, Wamsuta, they suspected of being poisoned because he died a couple days after going to a meeting in Plymouth. And then the whole thing with John Sassamon's death and accusing 3 native people of having murdered him, and then the native people, the tribe did not agree with that and thought this was more evidence that the English were no longer following the rules, and that original treaty was just null and void at that point. They had it, and it does not appear that Philip, who was the younger of the 2 sons of the Massasoit, that he was instigating and wanted to have a war. His warriors were pressing him, if we don't do something, we will not exist anymore. And they had good reason to say that. I mean, you know, it could have been that they would just be finally exterminated down in the Bristol Peninsula, and that would be it. There would be no more tribe. Gone. So there was a skirmish, broke out, war goes on. I could spend 2 hours talking about the war, but just so you know, it lasted for 14 months and ended close to where it started. Broke out in what is now Child Street in Warren, and then finished at Mount Hope in Bristol when John Alderman shot King Philip, and they drew and quartered him and took his head and put it on a pike and took it up to Plymouth, and it stayed there for 25 years as a warning. You don't ever do this again. So, well, you know, we hear about all these atrocities on both sides, and if you want atrocities, grow up in England like Roger Williams did. Read about Smithfield. I'm going over there in March, and you know, they were burning people at the stake on a regular basis. Williams grew up 100 yards away from Smithfield, where they burned people. It was just outside the city walls at that point. And he could smell human flesh as he was growing up as a kid, okay? So you want to find out how to treat people brutally, go to England then, okay? What we were doing over here was mild by comparison. So this war goes on, does finish in a relatively short period of time, largely because in December the English burned over 400 men, women, and children down at Great Swamp in southern Rhode Island, and that tipped the Narragansett's hand. They said, okay, we were neutral before, we're joining the war now. And if Philip had been able to get the Mohawks involved, they may very well have won the war and driven the English out back to England. But they ran out of ammunition and food in the spring, and you can read all about it. Philbrick's Mayflower is a good story of that whole. And that covered this whole area. They were really moving everybody to the coast. And here's Philip having been shot by another native whose brother was killed by Philip during the war, so it was a little revenge move. This is Benjamin Church. His gun misfired, so Alderman had the winning shot there. Today you can see evidence of the war. If you've been to, anybody been over to Bungtown? Yeah, there's a little monument for the Miles Garrison. This is what it looked like before. I think it burned in a fire in the early 1900s. This is the only picture we have up there. There's a monument there. We're going to try to put a better interpretive sign that tells the whole story. If you go to Mount Hope, you can see the marker where Philip was slain. You, of course, are familiar with Anawan Rock, right? Well, everything wrapped up there when Church got Anawan and captured him, and they stayed up all night trading war stories. A couple of good generals, you know, I did this and I did that, and what did you think of this? And, you know, they got along apparently quite well. Then they sent him to Plymouth and they hung him. So, the other evidence around here, and I'll show you a few of these, and then we'll get into Rehoboth and get into more detail on that and wrap up. But if you haven't been to some of these places, I recommend the ancient Little Neck Cemetery in Riverside. That's the grave of not only Thomas Willett, who started everything here, and who was mayor of New York City twice because he spoke Dutch. Okay. Elizabeth Tilley is buried there. She grew up in England, went to Holland with to Leiden with the Pilgrims, came over on the Mayflower, survived with her husband, and survived the King Philip War, even though their house was burned, and then ends up spending her later years in what's now Riverside with her sister, and of course she died there, and that's why she's buried there. Great story. Somebody needs to make a movie. I can't imagine what her life must have been like. And then John Miles' grave. You know, other places, East Providence, the Brigham Farm has been undeveloped for 400 years. Key Farm over in Warren, where they're still finding artifacts there. The one I like is Joetta Kirk's Chase Farm. It's a King's Grant Farm from 1697. Been in the family ever since. Wonderful piece of property, and they're very close to Margaret's Rock and Cave that I showed you before. Over in Barrington, you can find places like Sowams Woods and around Echo Lake. That's where, in the video, you saw where the hearths were found. You can't find them because they cover those up. The archaeologists don't want people digging around there. But they're Hamden Woods, and this is a wonderful little preserve in Bristol on the bottom of Narrows Road called the Wampanoag Preserve. Again, these are untouched places, if you will. If you want some idea of what things were like here 400 years ago, you can go to these places. This is my favorite up on the top here, Route 136, across from Johnson's Market there. There on the right side, if you're going south, on the right side of the road is this King's Rock, which I mentioned is right on literally straddles the state line there. Tim Johnson owns this end of it, and if you go up on the top of the rock, you'll find a groove in the rock filled with moss that Native women would roll a stone across to grind corn. It was called the National Grinding Stone. And then across the street on the D'Alessandro property, you'll see this, what's called a balanced or perched rock. The archaeologists say, oh, that's just a glacial erratic, and I say to them, glaciers don't put these rocks down on a high knoll on top of bedrock and stick a bunch of rocks underneath to keep it from moving. I don't think glaciers do that. People do that. But, you know, they say, well, you get me this bona fide story, I'll believe it, you know. So I want to develop this area as a 17th century historical place of native occupation. It was called Sachem's Knoll. Behind Town Hall in Swansea, you can find Abrams Rock. At Mount Hope in Bristol, you can still walk up to the cave if you go, not the cave, the seat. Go to the office during the week, Monday through Friday, at Mount Hope Farm, and they will give you directions and a permit you can put in your car so you can drive up there, and it's not too far to walk from there. And then at Pokanoket Hill, there's a place where remember the four tribes, Nipmuc, Massachusetts, Narragansett, and Wampanoag, they would meet there and have council among the four tribes there. So So that place is still there. Okay, now familiar territory. This is where you begin to tell me the story. What I found here in Rehoboth, you had some couple of blockhouses. They call them blockhouses, but they're garrison houses. Fortified houses that people would gather in when they were afraid they were going to be under attack. And in fact, they were quite successful in staying alive anyway. Of course, you're in the garrison house while your house is being burned, okay? But you're alive, okay? Cemeteries here, okay? I hope everybody's been. You stop at your cemeteries? Not too often, right? I've only been there once, but so this is Burial Place Hill, located at the corner of Providence and Peckham. The oldest known burial is of Richard Bowen, who died just before the King Philip War when he was 81. Though it's likely he was buried in Burial Hill, it hasn't been confirmed, but it was the only burying place at the time. And then Richard Bowen was born in Wales in 1594, and apparently his body is there in the cemetery as well. If you go on Find a Grave, you can find all the specific information. Then the Palmer's River Cemetery. You familiar with that one? This has the great story about it is William Cahoon was recruited and brought over as a brickmaker for the town of Swansea in 1673 or 4. And so he had just gotten here, really, and the war breaks out. So he goes down to the garrison, the Miles Garrison House, that's now in Swansea. But of course, at that time, would have been Rehoboth. But war breaks out, and several people are injured. So he decides he's going to come back up here to Rehoboth to get a doctor. And in the course of traveling, he's slain by native people, and his body was cut in pieces, so nobody knows for certain where he was buried, but they came to the cemetery back in 2000 something and did a burial, Christian burial for him. There's a whole page on the website about this, and you can read the story in detail, and you won't have to listen to my fractured version of that. And around the corner here, you've all been to the Carpenter, I hope. Okay, wonderful little museum. One of the reasons I want to do this heritage area is to get more people to come up here, because it's a fabulous museum, but nobody knows a thing about it. It took me a long time to even find it, and once I discovered all the things that are there, especially this whole collection from the Robbins Museum of tools excavated from the Toby site, which is also, about a half a mile from here. It's not marked, they don't want you to go there, but what they found was an encampment from about 3,400 years ago. Great archaeological dig, and we're able to pull out some of the tools there. You can also see that the pot on the right there, that was supposedly King Philip's personal pot. I guess he got it from the English, and that was somehow ended up in Benjamin Church's hands, and now it's over there in the museum. Not entirely sure. We'll see. I did a couple of interviews, and these are both online on the Sowams Heritage Area. Just look for there's a index there that says videos and interviews. And Jim Johnson, anybody know Jim? Yeah. There's a great story about the forges around here and understanding how you get bog ore out, and there's even places along the Palmer. I think you can find bog ore still along the Palmer there. You look for orange soil, right? Yeah. And then, of course, Ted Ballard, who did a lot of the Toby dig there. He was an amateur archaeologist and worked with the Robbins people, and I guess late 80s, early 90s on that dig. So it's around there. But I was glad to get 45-minute interviews from both of them, so you can hear what they had to say about both of those. And of course, the sketches by Joe Carpenter, etc. Anybody have anything more to say about this?
Just a question, is
Sure.
the Toby site still being actively
No.
explored? Okay.
No, like with all these archaeological sites, they do the dig, they sift through the soil, they do whatever they can to find what's there, and then they put it all back and cover it all up and don't tell anybody where it is. Because there are lots of people who would love to find it and do their own dig, and we don't want that to happen. And finally, the oldest houses here in town, what can you tell me about these? This is from people here in town who told me Kingsley House apparently is the oldest. Okay, but also I found the Nathan Bliss House just around the corner here. Okay, supposedly some parts of it from 1650. Yes? No? Okay, who knows? Okay, and then the Wheeler Ingles House, sometime prior to 1710. Okay, beautiful house. Did a fabulous restoration job. Is that yours?
No, my neighbors across the street.
Yeah.
By Diane Freed, and Freed is, I'm not sure exactly, but it's in that range, and it's
Right.
very authentic.
It's a good example of what houses would have looked like in the late 17th century. Okay, this is what they were building. And then some parts of the Hicks-Baxter homestead, anybody familiar with that? Might be prior to 1798, question mark. Okay, hard to know. The other houses in the area, they're all on the website over in Barrington, Swansea, Warren, Seekonk, just one house in Seekonk. And then Bristol has 3 houses, but the best one is the Bosworth House. It's now apartment buildings. None of these they're all in private hands except for the Martin House. If you want to see a 17th century house, Sundays in the summertime, the Martin House is open for tours. But the Bosworth House in Bristol I love because the wood for that house was brought over from England. And just like Rehoboth, in order to have a town, you had to have a church, you had to have a pastor, you had to have a parsonage. This is the parsonage that got Bosworth over to be the pastor so they could build the meeting house and have the church. And we're going to do a whole interpretive marker on High Street in Bristol for that. Well, here we are wrapping up. This is the place that got me started. This is the place, this burial site was the royal burial site of the Pokanoket tribe, okay, for at least 150 years. And we only know that because of what was taken from the grave sites that we could date, because there are Dutch and English objects in them, and a piece of pottery, you could tell it must have been produced at this place in England at this time, that kind of thing. So roughly 1550 to sometime up, at least up until the King Philip period, that was in use as a cemetery. We also are pretty sure that Osamequin himself is buried there because Virginia Baker found a grave site that had a red horseman's coat. I don't know if you remember the painting that you saw earlier, but he was given a red horseman's coat by the governor of Plymouth. So we know it was his coat. No one else would have had one. It was in a grave. He's not going to give it to somebody else. It must have been his grave. But he and graves of 42 native people were exhumed in 1913 by Charles Carr, who was the town librarian and amateur archaeologist, who got tired of people digging stuff up out of the gravel pit, which became Burrs Hill Park, and was used by the railroad to put the East Bay Bike Path Railroad through. It goes right through the park there. So he said, I'm getting this stuff out of there. He got permission from the railroad, exhumed 42 graves, sent the contents to museums, Hay Museum in New York, Heffenreffer in Providence, and the museum at Harvard. Peabody, is it? Yeah. That dispersed everything, and then because of the Native American Graves Reclamation Act, the Mashpee tribe, who is federally recognized, decided to go around and ask for everything back, demand everything back, which they did. And they got over 650 objects that Carr had taken out of the cemetery in 1913. Built the vault there underground and reburied everything that had been there. So everything that had been taken, at least that they could find at the time, has been returned to the Royal Burial Ground, and the tribe had a sacred ceremony then.
What does a Native American burial look like?
People are on their side, always facing the southwest, where it was thought their spirit would go, the setting sun. And Burrs Hill was a perfect place because it was up on a rise, overlooking not the Narragansetts. You wouldn't want to do this in Barrington because you'd be looking across the Seekonk River at your enemies, but over Adams Point there in Barrington, and then with the setting sun. So it was a perfect place. And if you're going to dig any kind of a hole with a clamshell hoe, you're going to go to a place that you can get into the soil. Well, this is a perfect place because it was sand and gravel. It was actually, it wasn't, we call it Burrs Hill. It was Burrs Hills. There were multiple hills there, and I have a picture that you'll see on the website. It was taken from on top of a 30-foot sand dune where the parking lot of that Burrs Hill Park is now. So we know it was nothing but hills and probably covered with some trees and things of that sort until 1924 when the town acquired it from the railroad, flattened it all out, made a park there, but fortunately left the burial site area. And people keep saying, because there are these kind of mounds there, oh, those must be Indian burial mounds. Well, no Indian made a burial mound. They were already there. They simply used those mounds as a sacred place. So that's what's there. We'll have an interpretive sign. So here's the tribe today. There they are up at Mount Hope in the upper right. These two gentlemen on the upper right are in their 80s and still dancing. That's what keeps you well. Here's the tribal council down here. This is the Sagamore of the tribe, Bill Guy, who the one in the first picture who met Nathaniel Philbrook. And this is the tribal council, and these are some native people from both Narragansett and the other tribes around the Providence area. So all of this is saying we want to have a national heritage area. Don't you think this is worth other people learning where these places are? Well then, I'll enlist your help in petitioning the federal government to proclaim this a Sowams Heritage Area sometime in the next 5 years. And we'll get a little federal money, so guess what? People can come to Rehoboth. I don't know if you're all geared up for lots of tourists, but you might get discovered. Yeah. Nobody knows for sure. I'm going over to London again, and they have the War Club. They might have the wampum belt at the British Museum, or a wampum belt anyway. But I think the wampum belt that the Massasoit had, I don't think anybody knows where it is. The tribe doesn't have it. Yeah.
Where is the Garrison House in Rehoboth? Where was that located?
Well, you'd have to find the sign, and then the location will be on the website. I put a little Google map there. It's just along the side of the road, and there's a yellow sign there. And it's up in the woods there, I guess. But I wouldn't recommend you stop your car to get out and go read the sign. Yeah, okay. Any other questions? Yeah?
We go back to Roger Williams for a second.
Sure.
There used to be Roger Williams Bakery, Roger Williams Cleaning, Roger Williams everything.
Oh, yeah.
Excuse me. What cheer? What cheer bakery? What cheer?
Sure.
What cheer? And I wondered, and the only explanation I ever got was that when Roger Williams first came into this area, the first words he said to the first Native American he saw were, what cheer? And
Well, yeah.
so you comment on this.
It was actually the other way around. It was Canonicus who said, what cheer Nitop? Nitop means friend. And Canonicus had learned that expression, and he greeted Roger with what cheer Nitop. So, yeah. But Roger, of course, was very familiar with this, with the language at the time. Yeah.
What's here today's equivalent of, hey, what's happening? Something
Yeah. What's up? Yeah. So it's a common greeting, but it's fascinating that the city of Providence has incorporated that. That's on all their trucks. Yeah. Right. Other questions? I think we're right about on time here. So there you have it.